Hi, Eli and Maddie. Daddy here again. I hope and trust you guys are still well, as always. I figured it was about time I finally got started on that long-mooted vlog about writing, on writing, I suppose. But just before I do, here is the famous Once Upon a Time in America poster, which I mentioned in a couple of previous vlogs. Anyway, one of the reasons, there's a couple, one of the reasons why I've delayed doing this vlog for a good while is because I was waiting for something that has now arrived. Well, I shall tell you what it is. I don't know if you recall, right back at the beginning of the first lockdown, I say first because it's looking like there may be subsequent ones. However, right back at the beginning, many moons ago, are we talking 7 months now? So anyway, right back in March, a scientist friend of mine who is also a children's author and illustrator called me up and said, I'm thinking of doing a book for children. I think the demographic was 4 to 7, explaining how viruses work with a particular focus on corona. And could she use my face from a photo from my childhood as the face of coronavirus? Of course, I said, yes, that would be fabulous. And it is here, Ezzy the Virus, a wonderfully charming book for children. You can order your copy from TSL Books. You can go online to their website. But it's a fabulous book, and I'm very proud to be the face of coronavirus. In fact, this particular illustration was modelled on this photo. But of course, one can't have a virus quite as pretty as I was at, I think, 5 that was. So what Rachel Hayward, the author, has done is made me a little more impish, a little more rapscallion, to capture the spirit of the coronavirus. My particular favourite pages are when I become highly infectious and begin proliferating. You can see lots of Ezzies. But it's a charming book and highly informative. So for those of you who do have children, order your copy of Ezzy the Virus from TSL Books. So, although I am not a scientist in any way, shape or form, I felt it just that this should join the other books in the cupboard that I have actually written. Or for you, of course, my first poetry collection, which I'm in. Another little poetry collection there. I was one of the featured authors in Orphans of Albion, which is a fabulously well produced book. And then second most importantly, my very first collection of short stories, Losing Henry, with that beautiful picture of me on the back there, which was my first really mature book, I feel. The poetry was kind of youthfully solemn. This is a grown-up book, and the reason why I mentioned this and why I'm doing the On Writing vlog is that once again, at the beginning of lockdown back in March, there was no prospect of any of my own books appearing in the near future. However, a couple of months in, I did procure, amazingly, a publishing deal. Actually, funnily, the second publishing deal for my new book, Fairy Tales and Oddities. This book was actually technically finished. It was quite long. It was a good 200 pages when me and your mum split up. So although there was a deal in place there, I didn't have any of my things. I didn't even have the computer with it on. So unfortunately, that deal fell through. However, a new publisher has taken it on, and it will be published in the new year coming up, and it has been extensively rewritten. I've scrapped a good 70 pages and added a whole new thing in it, and combined a couple of longer stories into one, and it's become a very different beast from what it originally was. Well, and of course, because I'm in a very different place in my life than I was back then. The very first words of Fairy Tales and Oddities were put to paper, I think, all the way back in 2011, when I was on holiday in Estonia, in the wonderful city of Tallinn, which enchanted me so much that I started writing a lovely story there. So yes, that will be out in the new year with fabulous illustrations by the wonderful artist Steve Poulakeres. So it's almost inevitable that your practical introduction to actually writing will come in the form of writing essays in school. We had to write an awful lot of essays in school on a wide range of subjects. And we had to do it longhand. You can actually do it on the computer. Of course, this wouldn't have been the case if you'd continued to grow up with me. But you're not allowed any of my experience in writing or music or anything else. And that's not to mention the love bit. But anyway, you're not allowed that, so there's no point in dwelling on regrets now. In the year we were allowed together, and we did most everything together, I babbled to you constantly and you babbled to me constantly. About whatever we fancied babbling about, including writing. I did babble to you a little about writing. Of course, understanding didn't come into it because you were a tiny baby, although a tiny baby getting rapidly larger, your growth was exponential. But I've always maintained and still maintain that it's important to keep up that near constant communication with babies because it builds their confidence subconsciously. So that when they come to be older and actually have to present themselves vocally, they're less worried about words. So what I would say, one thing about the essay, and this is a rule particular to the essay, it does not apply to creative writing, although it can. But the one rule, and of course there are hundreds and hundreds of thousands, you can go on ad infinitum about rules for good writing. But this vlog, and any subsequent ones I may choose to or feel like doing, is really just my favourite rules and ones that I always observe. And don't forget, of course, it's very healthy to observe the fact that rules are there often to be broken. But anyway, my one thing for essays is always try and make sure that the last line of each paragraph presages or presages, no one can quite agree on the correct pronunciation of this these days. I prefer presages because, like presagio in the Italian, it has a more melancholy ring to it. But anyway, always make sure that that last line presages the first line of the following paragraph, and of course subsequently the subject matter that that paragraph is going to be dealing with. Some writers have taken this to an absurd extreme. There are one or two rather tiresome people who actually use the last word to be the first word of it. I mean, that's just obsessive. That's crossed the line in the sand. That can't even see the line in the sand anymore. It's off the line in the sand into tropical tundra regions. And, the same goes for quantities. So you don't need a subclause or, that repeats in the next bit. Let it be known that you have a form and a plan and that you've thought it through, because that always reads better in essays. Watch your hads. Also, learn where you should use that and where you should use which. They're not just interchangeable, as some people think, although in places they can be, but learn which one's which and where they belong. I like to tell a story, although it's not entirely true. There's more to it than this, but it's fun. I went out with a girl and ended up having a fairly long and fruitful relationship with her because on our first date, she used the phrase "between you and me" and not the maddening "between you and I," which is what everybody seems to say these days. Each time I hear it, it's like a paper cut to my soul. I'll give you a further example. The other week, I read in a piece of journalism A brisk wind carried the dog and I to the top of the hill. Now, at first glance, you might think, well, that's perfectly acceptable. No, it is not. All you have to do is take out the so and so bit in the middle, the bit that doesn't need to be there, and then your ear should do it for you. So without the so and so bit, a brisk wind carried I to the top of the hill. Now, you'd never say that, would you? Stay in the tense. Try not to fall into the trap of adding to words which are already perfectly adequate. For example, the preposition among often these days gets turned into amongst. Why? I mean, that one in particular I would also call a genteelism. A genteelism is where you change a word because you think it makes you, the writer, sound more posh. Why you would want to do this, I do not know. A common example of this is regardless, which is often turned into irregardless. The word irregardless is meaningless. Likewise, the perfectly serviceable while becomes whilst. I mean, whilst is so ugly. And there are adverbs, people adding to adverbs, people abusing adverbs. I've heard of a dentist who says open widely. I mean, what's wrong with open wide? There was a famous actress who ended her Oscar acceptance speech with the phrase lastly but not leastly. I mean, what nextly? All writing, or good writing, is a war against cliché. Those ready-packaged, dead phrases that come along, from the small ones like bitterly cold or stiflingly hot, to the slightly longer phrases. And one of these longer phrases is everybody has a novel in them. Well-known phrase, completely dead phrase. And it's also an untrue phrase. It's surprising to find how many cliches are actually completely untrue. What everyone has in them is actually a memoir. And I guess with all these vlogs, and we're coming up on the 8-hour mark now, I guess that's what I'm doing for you in these vlogs. Leaving a memoir, but in a new way, I guess. And I should say the point of a memoir is, no matter what's happened in the past, the point of a memoir is to show all your nearest and dearest in the best possible light. Thus, of course, this vlog has been predominantly comic in nature, telling the crazy stories, etc. And I've left out all the bad stuff, or most of the bad stuff, as much as I could, without failing to make sense. The bad stuff can wait.
I don't feel alright in spite of these comforting sounds you make. I don't feel alright because you.
Hi, Eli and Maddie. Daddy here again. I hope you guys are still really well, as always. And welcome to part 2 of my vlog on writing. So last time we kicked off with a little bit of advice on writing essays, which, as I pointed out, will probably be the first things you end up writing properly. And that's ignoring all the things like shopping lists or thank you cards or whatever. And so to create a certain pleasing symmetry, I thought we could kick off today in a similar vein with another rule for writing essays, but this time a rule with a difference. Well, 2 differences, in fact, because this rule does not just apply to writing essays, it applies to all careful writing. good writing, but careful writing. And the rule is this. Well, I should just add, it's also very unusual for me, because I'm all about breaking rules and pushing the boundaries. This, unusually, is a rule you should never break. Absolutely never break it. And it's this: never start 2 consecutive paragraphs, consecutive mind, with the same word. It reads terribly, it looks careless. An attentive reader will spend a good 40 seconds wondering what's being done here, why is it? And they'll be forced to futilely conclude that actually it was just a waste of their time. Now, if you want to start 3 consecutive paragraphs, or more, but 3, more's starts to get a bit indulgent. If you want to start 3 consecutive paragraphs with the same word, oddly, that's fine, as long as you don't do it by accident, as long as you make a point. This is what I'm doing for a reason, for this reason or that reason. It's not for me to tell you what reason that might be. Although, to give you an example, when I did that same thing with 3 consecutive paragraphs beginning with the same word in my first collection of short stories, Losing Henry, I did it because my first person unreliable narrator was becoming increasingly paranoid, and it gives an uncomfortable feeling, and also what he was saying was becoming more and more unhinged. So the rule is 3 consecutive paragraphs beginning with the same word are okay if you know what you're doing, but never ever start 2 paragraphs with the same word. So before we move on, and while we're still on the subject of paragraphs and paragraphing, one quick last thing. When you're writing, try to just keep in mind a template of an average sized paragraph that makes you happy. Every writer's different. There are no set rules about this. Saul Bellow used to enjoy huge long paragraphs, but that was his style, and that was absolutely fine. Because the opposite looks slapdash. I'll give you an example. I've read many books that don't adhere to this rule. One that stands out in my mind, though, is the novel of a very famous and very brilliant film, a film which involves dinosaurs. Anyway, this book is a bizarre terrain of whole chapters, that long, followed by the first paragraph of the next chapter, 20 pages, and then followed by a 1-line paragraph. And as I said, it looks slapdash. And it also makes the reader, even subconsciously, slightly uneasy, because they're thinking, well, what? It just does. And the writer ought to have a good relationship with their reader. They ought to love and respect their reader. And in an ideal world, of course, they hope that their reader will love and respect them back. So yeah, just try and keep that in mind. Although, you can, again, it's one of those rules you can twist. So there is one story in, I think there's only one. Yeah, there's one story in the forthcoming Fairy Tales and Oddities that ends with a 1-liner. But, I make it fairly clear that that's what I'm doing. And it's a punchy last line. It's also a last line that has been prefigured earlier in the story, so it doesn't just come as a surprise. I can give you an example of this kind of thing from my music career, which is very early on I discovered writing orchestral scores, that a well-written orchestral score has an element, a minor element, but an element of design. It looks beautiful on the page as well as sounds how you want it to sound. It doesn't have to be beautiful, of course. Now, I say minor element of design because it's obviously not paramount. It's not the most important thing you're thinking about when you compose an orchestral piece. But any well-written score does look wonderful on the page. And a book, prose, should look. Poetry has its own internal, it looks already fairly well laid out. Now, it's also versified as well, so that's a bit different. But prose needs to look well presented. It needs to have that so the reader feels secure reading it. So we have just talked about not letting the reader pause without profit, which is, I think you'll agree, a very bad idea. But further, and perhaps most importantly, look at your prose for internal chimes, those sort of blocked noses and thorny corners and stubbed toes of prose. There's one right there, prose and toes. There you go. You can use the same word twice in a sentence. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. I don't know why people are obsessed with trying to change the second word, which means the same as the first word. It's odd. Use the same word. Much better, much clearer. But what I would say is don't use the same syllable twice in the same sentence. So, for example, reporter and importance. The reporter realized the importance of his story. That's dead prose. That sentence needs to be recast at the very least, if not thrown out instantly. Faction and artifact. So you're using the same syllable. This isn't a good thing. This is dead writing. I found this in a book recently that I was reading. I tend to try and read very good books, but sometimes, one finds oneself having to read something that you sort of... Anyway, it was so incredible, I actually had to write it down. This is a perfect example of a dead sentence. Once she knew I wouldn't love her less, she made me confess. Oh boy. So, time for a quick rant, if you'll permit me. Two things that drive me absolutely crazy and incandescent with fury. Primarily because I see them increasingly in journalism, even in some august publications. The first is, I would say, beware false quantities. So, one of the most common false quantities, and one that I know I have read at least 3 times in the last 6 months, including once in The Guardian, the horror, is rather unique. Unique is an absolute, it cannot be qualified. You cannot be rather unique. You can't be a little bit unique. You are either unique or you are not unique. You can't be a little bit dead and somewhat alive. It just doesn't make any sense. It's just sloppy. Of course, there are occasions, the most obvious being where you can use them in dialogue. You can use a false quantity in dialogue because you're shining a light on that character and how they might think and talk. So if you have the guts to do that, then you better as hell make sure you know to recognize them and not use them in your own work, because otherwise you do not have the right to shame that character. The second one that drives me absolutely bonkers, and perhaps more so because I'm seeing it increasingly, and nobody seems to know the rule, and it's so simple. This concerns whether it's a or an preceding a word that begins with H. The rule is so simple. The rule is if the word following starts with a silent H, then it's an. An honour, an heir to the fortune. Fine, perfect. But if the H is pronounced, it's a historical document, a hilarious joke. Remember that. Don't write anything that anyone else could have written. Always try to be original. This is harder than it sounds. But all that means really is try and be true to your subconscious. If you have any artistic sense at all, it will feel false. But also don't lose hope if you're a young writer, and I can only speak for young male writers, it all seems impossible sometimes. And it takes ages to get to your own voice. And you have to go through various ridiculous stages to find your voice. One of these, I mean, there are others, but one of these is all young male writers seem to go through the verbose stage, which is where we all want to, write like a young Will Self, but without the talent. So we all come out with like the best possible longish word to describe something, which really could be done in a much more clear manner. And I'm going to deal with this in a second. Language, style, plot, etc. People will argue forever about this. And why not? It's worth arguing about. But to my mind, there are 5 main elements, ingredients, or measuring posts of good fiction. And they are structure, character, plot, themes, and style. Obviously, the argument goes there are a lot more. But the way I look at it is all of the things you can come up with can generally be seen to fit into one of those 5. So, for example, structure also includes rhythm. Very important, of course, but fits into the structure. Style includes language, etc. So you can generally fit all of the things you can come up with as extras into one of those 5. And you can use these 5 as a sort of scoring system of your own work, which ones you score consistently highly on and which ones you perhaps score less well on. The one that I'm generally criticised for is plot. Plot has never been what I'm most interested in. For me, I'm much more interested in the style. Style to me is everything. Character and structure, extremely important to me. And themes, yes, very important. But the least important to me is plot. I mean, there are some truly great novels that have literally no plot. I should just add one last thing on this. I didn't say they were in any order of importance. But if you do care what I think, style would definitely be number 1 for me. So, a quick little piece of advice on titles. There are various gradations of title. There are titles that seem to live and breathe on every page of the book. Lolita, London Fields. There are titles that seem to have always existed. And it seems unfathomable that one person could have ever just come up with them. An obvious example, Pride and Prejudice. Then there are the genius titles. Hangover Square, Ballad of the Sad Cafe. Catch-22. Catch-22, a title so genius and iconic that it went straight into the language. A quick funny anecdote about Joe Heller and Catch-22. Remember, Catch-22 was his first book. Still an utter classic. But anyway, whenever in an interview Joe Heller was asked, why have you never written a better novel or a better book than Catch-22? Heller would quietly smile and go, who has? Anyway, the piece of advice on titles is never pun in a title. I'm not sure why, but it always seems to guarantee a mediocre work, a minor work. For example, a nip in the air, where air is H-E-I-R. A blot on the landscape, where blot is actually the name of a character in the book, B-L-O-T-T. Just don't do it. Even if the work is good, a title like that would instantly put off a lot of readers, and rightfully so. Don't do it. So I will quickly finish up with this, because I'm aware this vlog is probably getting a little long. However, I have to include this because a viewer of part 1 of On Writing emailed me and asked me to include this. and it concerns the subjunctive. So what I would say is that, somewhat amusingly, the subjunctive is subjective. It relies on context. But there are two main things to remember to help with this, and they are the formality issue and the British versus American issue, or English versus American issue. So, formality. A politician in a speech would hopefully not say, if this situation was to become a global pandemic. They would say, if this were to become a global pandemic, because that were carries more weight and gravitas. And these days politicians could do with more gravitas, not to mention humour. The other thing is, an American, an educated American, would usually say, if that were me, I'd, whereas a British person would say, if that was me, I'd. So it's about the context. Neither are incorrect. But when it concerns things like dialogue, remember how your character would speak. And for goodness sake, remember where your characters are from. Fairy Tales and Oddities is a roaring rampage through styles, from a P.G. Woodhouseian sexual farce to American travelogue, and genres including sci-fi and magical realism, a comic cascade of 10 interconnected stories. Fairy Tales and Oddities reinvents old favourites for an adult audience and creates new ones for the fresh generation.
I got mine, Fairy Tales and Oddities.
I've got mine.
We got ours.
I loved Fairy Tales and Oddities.
Bloody hated it.
Our home is all around us. Our love is all around us.
My mum won't let me read this yet, but I want to.
Tempur-Pedic take us the ocean.
We got ours.
Our backyard is the bay. From the morning to the evening, swimming onward through the day. Swimming onwards through the day. Our home is all around us. Our love is all around us. Our love is all around us.
Welcome to an introduction to Fairy Tales and Oddities, bite-sized. Fairy Tales and Oddities is my new book, a collection of 10 interconnected short stories that play with language and style through comedy, mysterious history, and threatening magic. Each day I shall introduce a different story, say a few words, and read a short extract. I hope you enjoy. So let's kick off with One Angry Man, a dystopian tale about a fellow who has been genetically predetermined to be a threat to children and has as such been imprisoned by the government in a perspex box. The Archbishop of Canterbury, who I felt it was about time somebody made a woman, is campaigning to have this man freed because he hasn't actually done anything wrong. Yet. The computers were bright red. The work surfaces were yellow, the walls were blue, and the landlines were green. Altogether, the third floor. On the second floor, the work surfaces were red, the phones were yellow, the walls were blue, and the computers were green. On the first and ground floors, the remaining permutations were expressed. This arrangement greatly irritated the people who had to work in the building, those people who flitted up and down from colour to colour. They interpreted the scheme as an insult to their ability to remember which floor they were on. In truth, the building was deliberately tailored so as to advertise the totality of its constituent schema. Software, hardware, communications, furniture, and exterior fabric were the product of one complete contract. The apparent inconvenience of the colour scheme only served to advertise the singularity of the organic control that could be imposed on a single office building, a vertical slice of working space. Abigail knew this because she was stuck on the ground floor reading the brochure in the lift. She had time to read most of it while her clearance was being processed. Cal was deliberately slowing her down. When the phone call from reception came through, she'd been backing up personnel files for the 5th time that day. The loud shring delivered her from her reverie of mindless routine. She waited for the 3rd shring to sound out before plucking the receiver. Answer too quickly and it shows you're not doing anything. Answer too slowly and you're too far from your desk. Alpha Subject Containment Services, how may I help you? Spare it. It's Mel and Aya downstairs, ground floor. We've got the Archbishop. The Archbishop of Canterbury? That's the one. Christ. Not yet. Just the Archbishop. She wants to feed the angry or something, apparently. Christ. Right. Reverend Bleeding Heart, right here in the lobby. What do I do? Cal looked at the angry. The angry waved. She hated that. Maybe she'd spray him later on, give him something to whimper about. His ceiling was festooned with a great many cylindrical nozzles, and she had a great many buttons to play with. The Archbishop can wait in a lift, she decided. Yes, she bloody well could. Welcome to an introduction to fairy tales and oddities, bite-sized. Fairy Tales and Oddities is my new book, a collection of 10 interconnected short stories that play with language and style through comedy, mysterious history, and threatening magic. Each day, I shall introduce a different story, say a few words, and read a short extract. I hope you enjoy. Aliasadora is by some stretch the longest story in the volume. It concerns a trio of characters and how they interact. A young Jewish female journalist, a young unemployed black man, and Milo Milkins, fading ex-snooker star, now TV pundit, middle-aged, disillusioned, heavily drug and alcohol dependent, and fulminantly racist. I shan't spoil the plot for you, but there are two hinge moments. One, a burglary that takes place on Milo's orders, and a flood of epic, almost biblical proportions. I hope you enjoy. The final years of Milo the Maelstrom Milkins' professional snooker career had been pockmarked by well-publicised outbursts. The time Milo headbutted the only black player on the tour, a sepulchral Muslim with a refulgent beard, whom Milo accused of leaving tiny wiry hairs on the table post-shot to disrupt his play. The time he was sent off for mooning a visiting business delegate of potential African sponsors. The time he outraged women's groups by holding his cue in front of his trousers and miming athletic sexual action 2 feet behind a female referee. It wasn't pretty. None of it was pretty. Milo was still sore about that last one. He claimed a setup. If female groups had infiltrated the match, he argued, then they simply had it coming. They couldn't have been there for the game. Obvs. Incredibly, none of these misadventures seemed to dent his fan base, which, if one could reasonably gauge by what one read in the press and online, was louder and stronger than ever, now that he was no longer winning matches on a regular basis. It should be noted, however, that Milo was a legend on the circuit. Despite having won only 3 ranking titles during a 20-year career, the Maelstrom was 12 times a World Championship semi-finalist and 15 times a Masters semi-finalist. More than once, he had had a wonderful and inspiriting fight back from many frames down and had delivered his share of incredible shots. 5 YouTubed massays, crawls, drags, run-throughs, deep screws, reverse doubles, double kisses, jumps, swerves, stuns, controlled cannons, controlled safeties, rescued backspins, piquets, pushes, plants, checked side, caroms, plain ball runs. Hell, for a while, even his miscues were news. His matches had often gone on well into the wee small hours of British TV, and perhaps this was part of the appeal. If enough people watched you being brilliant while they got drunk, anyone could become a hero. Welcome to an introduction to Fairy Tales and Oddities, bite-sized. Fairy Tales and Oddities is my new book, a collection of 10 interconnected short stories that play with language and style through comedy, mysterious history, and threatening magic. Each day, I shall introduce a different story, say a few words, and read a short extract. I hope you enjoy. So today we turn to Bluebeard, my retelling or reimagining of Duke Bluebeard's castle, one of the few existing fairy stories in Fairy Tales and Oddities. Bluebeard has traditionally been portrayed as a serial murderer, but of course, I go about things in my own inimitable fashion. After the wedding ceremony, a modest affair with a standing buffet rather than a formal meal, and no guests on the groom's side, Bluebeard took his bride back to the house. House was a rather inadequate word, however, as she found when it heaved into view. Athlone was a dark place. Even the name was sombre, mournful, and it was enormous, with east and west wings and cornetto minarets in the centre. Bluebeard had lived there so long that no one in the town could recall if ownership was ancestral or he'd bought it. Either way, Bluebeard hadn't aged in many years. While not an obviously intimidating presence, the villagers avoided Bluebeard on his infrequent trips to town because of the mystery. We fear those who don't appear to need human contact. It seems we don't see them often. Many times he wore a stretched, quiet smile, which had the effect more than anything else of blindness, the private pleasure of his nature, personality lines drawn long. His wife seemed an unusual choice, the gregarious daughter of a rich merchant named Hans Kansa. She had easy, Forsythia charm, unused to suffering. Early 20s, teapot cheekbones, twice a winner of the town's Little Beauty contest. There was nothing materially boastful there, simple strength in biology. Her father was the wealthiest man in town, other than Bluebeard himself, and strictly speaking, Athlone was 3 miles outside town. From a droll point of view, it's easy to wonder at the attraction, but we shouldn't. Bluebeard, although old and publicly undramatic, had secure charisma that was undeniably attractive. For a girl who'd grown up with a powerful father, it was a natural progression. "So finally we are here," said Bluebeard. "My castle is not a place of celebration or gaiety like your father's. Speak to me. Are you coming?" He stepped down from the coach and extended his arm. Above Athalone's turrets, birds wheeled in currents. "I'm coming, darling Bluebeard. 1 moment, please." She gathered her things and took his arm to step down onto the gravel. "Are you coming?" "Oh yes, darling Bluebeard." The castle gates groaned open for them, and she turned. "I have left my family for you, darling Bluebeard. Please never reject me. I love you wholeheartedly, darling Bluebeard, even as we cross your icy threshold." And they embraced, before down 3 steps and on through the inner doors. Welcome to an introduction to fairy tales and oddities, bite-sized. Fairy Tales and Oddities is my new book, a collection of 10 interconnected short stories that play with language and style through comedy, mysterious history, and threatening magic. Each day, I shall introduce a different story, say a few words, and read a short extract. I hope you enjoy. Daddy's a cipher. In many ways, he's already absent. But I should put down something about him here before he's really gone. Exodus time, or whatever, does that to you, makes one thing fill your whole eyes, leaving no time for any extra light. Extremities feel tenderized, pulled out, like making the shape of a snow angel, fingertips, toes, the tiny vulnerable human ends. Mummy and Daddy met in Jerusalem 36 years ago. I never got to see Jerusalem before it was destroyed. Met in a warm and well-lit place, he used to say. Even then, he was a man of apparent elegance and certain regular habits. His lungs weren't good, had never been good, but he thought himself happy. His disturbed breathing formed questions into assertions. After the wedding, in full colour, they returned here to our city and poverty. But he began to train as a doctor of the eyes, an ophthalmologist, I think it's called. We have no internet anymore to check, and books have been confiscated. And eventually a fair income materialised. Mummy said that while he studied, concentrating hard, bent over books, his lungs would whistle like an asthmatic old woman's. I came along after 5 years, and since by then Mummy already felt that something had withered in their love, I was the welcome fresh face. Daddy wasn't given to extravagant gestures, preferring calm and even silly ones. But he was a cautious man and demanded absolute silence at night, so that even while sleeping he could watch over the noises of the house, the squeaks and groans, the archival yaws. These are the things I remember, Daddy. Oh yes, and he always shaved by touch. I never knew why. It wasn't for lack of a mirror. Perhaps feeling the scratch, scratch, scratch relaxed him. Perhaps it was merely nostalgia for his own father. Little things can soothe, can turn a day from bad to good. One could be happy here. That I understand. These are the things I remember, Daddy. But then he began to change. Routine would be forgotten. Former fastidiousness waned. I didn't really notice it, or care, I guess, until my late teens. Sometimes a complete picture of our lives would shine in his eyes and then be gone. Fizz. A totally unrelated subject announced by a tiny incline of the chin. From time to time he took on false expressions. At a dinner party he'd suddenly look like a bewildered small boy. Looks that didn't correspond to the situation. The way deaf people have of looking at things. They look. These are the things I remember, Daddy. Exasperation grew within him, but he couldn't recognize it and grew more exasperated for that. One day he retraced every step he'd taken, looking for lost coins. Mummy said he'd talk for hours on the alarming state of his intestines. In my 20-year-old life there was an empty space of Daddy's perfect size and shape. Unsettlingly tranquil movements. Speaking as if with a gravelly sediment on the tongue. Then his speech began to contain incoherences, full adult sentences with one false quantity. Don't worry, sweetie, your college fund is in fine fettle. I made sure of that. But why is there a fly in your eye? By this stage, there was enough hair on his hands to account for what had fallen off his head. Daddy, I remember.